and welcome to Western Civ, episode 301, Without an Heir. Back in England, the Queen was not well. Smallpox was a major issue in England throughout Elizabeth's reign. In the early 1560s, it was, seemingly, everywhere. It was one of the most dreaded diseases of the 16th century, because even if you survived it, you might be scarred for life. Elizabeth was at Hampton Court on October the 10th, 1562, when she first felt unwell. Following prevailing medical opinion, she immediately took a bath and then went for a brisk walk. As a consequence, she caught a chill and had to retire to bed immediately, running a light fever. Dr. Burkhardt, a respected but irritable German physician, was summoned to examine her. He diagnosed smallpox, but there were no pots, and so the Queen dismissed him for a fool. No eruptions appeared, which many believed to be the token of the onset of a serious attack, and a day or so later, her fever grew worse. By October the 16th, she was extremely ill, first becoming incapable of speech, and then lapsing into an unconscious state in which she remained for 24 hours. The royal doctors, fearing that her death was imminent, sent urgently for William Cecil to come. The next night, Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness as the crisis approached, and there were hurried convenings of an anxious Privy Council, whose members were all panic-stricken over the unresolved matter of the succession. If the Queen died, as most believed she would, who should succeed her? Over the next few days, there were urgent discussions, with the councillors, according to many, divided in their opinions. Extreme Protestants favored Lady Catherine Grey, while moderates supported the Earl of Huntingdon, who had no near-blood relationship to the Queen. The rest wanted the judiciary to determine the matter. No one spoke in support of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. But consensus continued to be lacking, which hinted at deep divisions and boded ominously for the future. As the court prepared to go into mourning, Lord Hudson persuaded the reluctant Dr. Burkhardt, some say at the point of a dagger, to resume his treatment of the Queen. Following a curative measure first used by the Arabs and recommended by the English medieval physician John of Gaddesden, Burkhardt ordered that she be wrapped in red flannel, laid on a pallet beside a fire, and given a potion of his devising. 2 hours later, Elizabeth was conscious and able to speak. Elizabeth, though conscious, remained aware she was gravely ill. She would later tell a parliamentary delegation, quote, "Death possessed every joint of me." Her only goal at that time was to make a plan for England in the event of her death. Her answer? Robert Dudley. She commanded the Privy Council to declare him Lord Protector of England and grant him a massive salary of £20,000 per year. Her councillors were dismayed, but did as they were told, and preparations were laid for Dudley to take over the government of England. Shortly after this, Dr. Burkhardt returned with yet another treatment. It was then that Elizabeth first noticed the red eruptions of smallpox on her hands. At first she was upset at what this might mean for her appearance, but Burkhardt scolded his patient and said that the spots were a good sign. They would soon scab and fall off, but the worst was over. He diagnosed Elizabeth on the mend then and there. 6 days later, the Queen had fully recovered. But the entire episode left more than just Elizabeth's hands scarred. She had survived, sure, but had she not, the entire kingdom had just walked up to the precipice of civil war. Everyone now realized there needed to be some solution to the succession issue, and it had to be done now. Most believed Elizabeth could solve this herself, that she should simply marry right now. As for Dudley, he had very nearly become the King of England. And shortly after her illness ended, Elizabeth finally raised him to the Privy Council. In order to keep the peace, by the way, she simultaneously raised his great rival, the Duke of Norfolk, to the same position. Now, whatever people thought of Dudley, he took his job seriously. In fact, Dudley attended more Privy Council meetings than most in the years before his death. On the 25th of October, Elizabeth resumed her normal activities, but she did not call Parliament into session. She knew her illness had altered the public attitude toward her marital status. She knew once Parliament was in session, it would demand she pick a husband, get married, and have children. So she delayed. In November, Elizabeth had a furious encounter with her Privy Council, who insisted that it had the right to intervene in the issue of her marriage because it impacted the whole kingdom. By the end of November, Elizabeth had to call Parliament because, fortunately for her, she was out of money. Parliament opened on January the 12th, 1563, and it was clear from the opening ceremony the issue of Elizabeth's marriage would be front and center. Both houses wrote petitions urging the Queen to marry. Both petitions were couched in humble terms, reminding Elizabeth of the terror felt by her subjects during her illness and warning her what might ensue if she died without naming her successor. Quote, "The unspeakable miseries of civil wars, the perilous intermeddlings of foreign princes with seditions, ambitions, and factious subjects at home, the waste of noble houses, the slaughter of people, subversion of towns, unsurety of all men's possessions, lives and estates, attainders, treasons, a host of calamities. We, Parliament, fear a faction of heresies in your realm, contentious and malicious papists. From the conquest to the present day, the realm was never left as now it is, without a certain heir. If your highness could conceive or imagine the comfort, surety, and delight that should happen to yourself by beholding an imp of your own, it would sufficiently satisfy to remove all manner of impediments and scruples." Unquote. Elizabeth always took the view that neither her marriage nor the succession were the business of her subjects, but matters for herself alone. Yet she could not afford to alienate Parliament, and therefore resorted to deliberate procrastination. After a dinner on the 28th of January, she graciously received the delegation from the Commons. In the gallery at Whitehall Palace, the Speaker, on his knees, presented the Commons' petition, which she thankfully accepted, and then delivered an oration in which she assured him and his fellow subjects that she was as worried as they were about the succession, and had been especially so since her illness. She won sympathy by confiding that the matter had occupied her mind constantly as she recuperated, saying, quote, "Yet I desired I not then life, so much for my own safety as for yours," end quote. Ultimately, Elizabeth would conclude by reminding the House of Commons that choosing a husband was a serious matter. If she chose the wrong person, then England might not have to wait for her death for civil war to erupt. Or, perhaps even worse from some people's perspective, England might be Catholic once more. Now, 2 days later, the exact same petition arrived from the House of Lords. The Lords put their cards on the table. They would not tolerate Mary Stuart as queen, so Elizabeth had to marry someone. Anyone. Even Dudley. That's right. The Lords were now willing to agree to Robert Dudley just to get the marriage done. Both houses were getting restless. On February the 12th, the Commons wrote to the Queen, gently reminding her that they were still waiting for a formal response to their petition. Elizabeth continued to equivocate. In truth, she was just waiting for Parliament to grant her a subsidy. Once it did, she was determined to close it then and there. Parliament had by then proceeded to its other business, that of passing legislation to protect the Anglican settlement of 1559. These acts extended the oath of supremacy required from all in public life and imposed penalties upon those who upheld the priority and authority of the Pope and those who opposed the Church of England. In February, Convocation approved the restoration of the 39 Articles of Henry VIII in place of the 42 Articles of Edward VI. These were then enshrined in the Church's basic doctrines and were finally approved by Parliament in 1571. Then, on the 10th of April, Parliament assembled for its closing ceremonies. The Queen, who had been voted her subsidy now, attended and gave the Lord Keeper a handwritten answer to the petition. Fuming over her subjects' temerity, she had written 2 earlier drafts which referred to the 2 huge scrolls they had given her. but ultimately she amended her response as her irritation and frustration subsided. In her final version, Elizabeth responded to the demands that she marry as follows, quote, "If any here doubt that I am, as it were by vow or determination, bent never to trade that way of life, i.e. to be single, let them put out that kind of heresy, for your belief therein is awry. For though I can think it is best for a private woman, yet do I strive with myself to think it not meet for a prince. And if I can bend my liking to your need, I will not resist such a mind. I hope I shall die in quiet with nunc dimittis, which I cannot be without, and I see some glimpses of your surety in my graved bones." End quote. That was essentially an answerless, as it was proclaimed by Parliament, a response that said absolutely nothing. But in the end, a lot had happened as a result of this Parliament. By rejecting Mary Stuart's claim, the House of Lords had implicitly endorsed Lady Catherine Grey as Elizabeth's successor. She had been in the Tower since August 1561, and both she and her secret husband had been treated quite well. What Elizabeth did not know was that the jailers had allowed the couple to spend several nights together. As a result, by the fall of 1562, Catherine was pregnant again. She gave birth to another son in February 1563. Elizabeth, incensed, practically lost her mind as a result, and demanded that the two never be allowed to see another again. And they never did. But there was no question now that Catherine was Elizabeth's heir. Obviously, though, she doesn't succeed Elizabeth, as I'm sure you know. Catherine would die of tuberculosis in 1568. William Cecil took guardianship of their two sons and brought them up with his own children. Edward Seymour would go on to marry twice more, but never seemed to have been involved in his children's lives. Likewise, to the north, in February 1563, scandal also touched Mary Stuart. Since her return to Scotland, she had always had a certain nostalgia for the French court, and employed as her secretary a young French courtier called Pierre de Chastelard. Unwisely, Mary showed him favor, but he soon grew way too ambitious in his behavior toward his mistress, and could have seriously compromised her honor when he was discovered hiding under her bed by a Scottish lord who were jealous of his influence. They arrested him, and on the 22nd of February, he was executed. But for the moment, affairs to the north involving Mary Stuart remained a little bit of a sideshow. After Elizabeth recovered from smallpox, the 6,000-strong English force left for New Haven in France to support the Huguenots. But as we discovered last week, the murder of François de Guise and capture of the Huguenot leaders had allowed Catherine to bring peace to France, albeit temporarily. As a result, both the Protestant and Catholic factions ganged up on the English, who then suffered an outbreak of plague. Quickly, the situation appeared far from tenable. On the succession front, the troubles continued as well. Mary Stuart had supported Elizabeth during her illness, and that made Elizabeth more inclined toward her Scottish cousin. But as always with these things, there were a lot of issues to consider. The Lords probably would not accept Mary as their heir apparent, but neither could Elizabeth formally exclude Mary without running the almost certain risk of war with Scotland and possibly France as well. Cecil simply continued pressing Elizabeth to marry. Now, interestingly, it was around this time that Elizabeth conceived of the idea that Mary Stuart should wed, wait for it, Robert Dudley. It was not such a preposterous notion as it may first sound. Dudley was the one man who could be trusted to promote England's welfare north of the border. Indebted to Elizabeth for his rise to power and an almost princely status, he would not likely forget the woman for whom he felt a genuine affection, if not love. Dudley was hungry for a crown, and maybe a penchant for attractive redheads. By marrying him, Mary would remove herself from the European marriage market, and the threat of foreign influence in Scotland would recede. As a Protestant, Dudley would be acceptable to the Calvinist lords, and would hold the Scottish Catholics in check. The drawback, obviously, was that Elizabeth would have to give him up. But it seems that she had already decided to embrace celibacy, and hard as renouncing him would be, she convinced herself that she could do so if she knew that it was in her and England's advantage. Moreover, royal marriage negotiations took so long that their parting might be months, if not years, away. Cecil supported the idea, but in his case, that was only because doing so would get Dudley far, far away from the English court. In July, Elizabeth finally agreed to allow the English to retreat from New Haven. It seemed now that there was little prospect of ever recovering Calais. But the plague-ridden English army returning was not a boon to the Queen. Soon, plague was raging uncontrolled throughout England, and it would continue to ravage the kingdom all that summer. That August, Elizabeth dispatched a messenger to Mary Stuart, telling her that if she accepted an English husband of Elizabeth's choosing, then Scotland would have English protection and Mary would have protection from her Calvinist subjects. Mary wrote back inquiring just who this Englishman might be, but Elizabeth would not say. For the moment, as usual, she only wanted to delay Mary's marriage choice and prevent her from choosing a match who might be adversarial to the English court. Somewhat luckily for Elizabeth, by this point it was clear that Don Carlos, Philip's deranged and deformed son, was dying. So at least Mary could not marry him, and thus England would not be surrounded by Catholic enemies. At least, not yet. It was at this time Elizabeth, mindful of her promise to Parliament, attempted to revive negotiations for her own marriage to the Archduke Charles. This appears at first to be a forlorn hope, though, because despite being reminded of the advantage of the alliance, the Holy Roman Emperor was justifiably suspicious of Elizabeth's motives and would not have forgotten that she had formerly rejected his son. There was also persistent gossip about Robert Dudley. He now had apartments next to the Queen's in every royal palace. He was the host at most courtly entertainments. He kept state like a prince and enjoyed vast power and influence. In spite of these obstacles, Elizabeth expected the Archduke to make the first move toward reviving his courtship. It was unthinkable that she, as a woman, would take the initiative. Cecil, therefore, wrote to one of his agents in Germany, who in turn approached the Duke of Württemberg, who in his turn then sent a letter to the Emperor. Courtship took a long time back then. Ferdinand consented to the reopening of negotiations, but proceeded with caution, as did Cecil, who made it clear that the Archduke must take matters slowly, since the Queen was much inclined towards staying celibate. She had acknowledged that the Archduke was the best foreign match for her, but she waxed alternatively hot and cold over the matter. In January 1564, the imperial ambassador sat down with Elizabeth and Cecil privately to discuss the issue. Elizabeth bluntly told him that the Archduke had to make the first move. Her honor would not allow otherwise. She further stated that if she ever married, quote, it would be as a queen and not as Elizabeth, end quote. In other words, she needed to know the material benefits that this match would bring to England. Confused and dissatisfied, the imperial ambassador went home. By March 1564, there was no way that Elizabeth could continue to conceal the identity of Mary's husband-to-be. Cringing, her ambassador told Mary it was none other than Robert Dudley. Mary was completely taken aback. Perhaps had the offer been joined with a guarantee that Mary would be the heir apparent, then she might have considered it. But there was no such addendum. Mary, like most people, just didn't take the offer seriously. She, like most people, believed that Elizabeth would never part with Dudley. Hence, They believed it was just a delay tactic, which quite frankly, it probably was. Regardless, Mary had absolutely no interest at all in the match and was once more angling for a connection with a foreign prince. When Elizabeth offered to meet with Mary in person that summer, Mary declined. On April the 11th, England and France signed the Treaty of Troyes, bringing the hostilities between them to an end and placing Calais firmly beyond the reach of English recovery. In June, Philip II sent a new ambassador to England, Don Diego de Guzman de Silva, who did a lot actually to foster good Anglo-Spanish relations. In that very same month, Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor that is, Ferdinand died and was succeeded by his eldest son, who was crowned Maximilian II. These events brought talk of Elizabeth's marriage to the Archduke to a temporary standstill, but the new emperor was more in favor of the match than his father had been, although anxious that his brother, quote, would not, as on the last occasion, suffer himself to be led by the nose, end quote. On August the 5th, one of the most famous progresses of her reign brought Elizabeth to Cambridge, where she stayed for 5 days. Attired in a gown of black velvet slashed with rose and studded with pearls, the Queen entered the city preceded by trumpets and attended by a magnificent retinue. There she was welcomed by Cecil in his capacity as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and by scholars, quote, lowly kneeling, crying, Vivat Regina, end quote. When Elizabeth left on the 10th of August, she declared she would have stayed longer had there been adequate provisions available. Again, in an age when legitimacy and pageant went hand in hand, Elizabeth was a master. After the progress, Elizabeth dispatched a messenger to the new Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, congratulating him on his coronation. But there were rumors that this messenger was actually going to finalize a marriage alliance with the Archduke. These rumors were false. Elizabeth still intended to wed Mary and Robert Dudley, though Mary had no intention of going through with it. In reality, all of these moves and counter-moves and dissensions were simply Elizabeth stalling for time. However, on the September 28th, Elizabeth finally raised Dudley to the peerage, reportedly to make Queen Mary, quote, think more of him, end quote. It was around the same time that Elizabeth, according to him, admitted to the Scottish ambassador that she had no intention herself of ever getting married. Mary, for her part, now having moved beyond the dream of Don Carlos, which was a nightmare in reality anyway, began to think about marrying Lord Darnley. He had connections in Scotland and was an ardent Catholic. But the only issue was that he was a resident at the English court, and Elizabeth was not about to let him go to Scotland to wed Mary. A meeting of the Scottish and English lords that November ended poorly when the English lords refused any guarantee that Mary would be heir apparent no matter who she married. Elizabeth continued to offer potential matches, now including the Earl of Leicester, but would not commit to anything on the succession front. In December, succession issues resurfaced when Elizabeth fell dangerously ill. Bishop John Jewel of Salisbury spoke for many when he wrote, quote, "Oh, how wretched we are, who cannot tell under what sovereign we are to live. God will, I trust, long preserve Elizabeth to us in life and safety," end quote. Luckily for him, he was prophetic. Elizabeth was destined to live a long, if not particularly in terms of children, fruitful life.